want to welcome everyone to the workshop on cyber diplomacy. We've got four speakers from very different vantage points on the general issue. I think it's going to be quite interesting. I'm going to ask the speakers to try to limit themselves to about maximum 10 to 15 minutes each, so that we would have not only plenty of time for questions from the audience, but also a response rebuttal again for each other if and when you'd like to respond. I'll just start off with 60 seconds of Marshall McLuhan. Everybody knows Marshall McLuhan's famous comment, "The medium is the message." But far fewer people, other than those who are media scholars, know about his other adage, which related, or his theory, which related to what he called the rear view mirror syndrome, or in Hebrew, tismonet hamara hachorit. He basically said that the major problem we have with new media, when a new medium comes on stream, is that those of us who use the new medium in the beginning tend to use it in ways that reflect the way we used to use the old medium, because that's basically all we know. We know how we use the old medium. We then take a look at the new medium as something that, all right, it works a little better, maybe it's a little more efficient, maybe it's a little faster, and we don't really understand that the new medium has its own specific language. And it takes several years, at the very least, for the professionals in the field and the public as well to learn the new language of the new medium. Just to give you one historical example, for several years after radio started in the 1920s in the United States, there was no advertising whatsoever, and then finally they decided, well, they have to have some kind of economic basis, so they started advertising. The first advertisement on American radio was for a project, a building project in Queens, New York. They basically took the specifications from the newspaper, the New York, I think it was the New York Times of that day, and for 15 minutes they read off the advertisement on the air, not realizing, of course, that what the eye can handle in a quick read, the ear cannot handle listening to 15 minutes of specifications. The point here is that we are really only at the very beginning of the new medium that we call the internet. And cyber diplomacy is going to have to try to come to grips with the real question of not whether the internet and all the other new media involved here in cyber diplomacy can do what we did in the past a little better, but rather can we do it differently? Can we use these new media in ways that have not been used by other media in the past, because the other media in the past could not do what what cyber diplomacy or what the new media can do. Having said that, I will give the floor to Professor Philip Seib, who is the director of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California.
Good morning. Yesterday I spoke with you about international broadcasting, and we'll take a leap into the future now and talk a bit about diplomacy, cyber diplomacy, and to give you a sense, a little bit of self-advertising here of how things are changing. Just this morning in an email exchange, I agreed with a publisher to write a book called Real-Time Diplomacy, Power and Politics in the Social Media Era. It's a fascinating topic. I'm looking forward to it. I have no idea when I'm going to find time to write it, but it's in fact, that the publisher jumped on it so quickly is an indication that times are changing in terms of the technologies of diplomacy. And what we're talking about in terms of cyber diplomacy, to a certain extent, is the building of networks, what we might call cyber communities of interest. There's a need for priorities from the standpoint of a country trying to conduct public diplomacy to decide who should be included in these communities. Now, if you'll indulge me, I want to talk very briefly about a theory behind this. Since I'm a university professor, I'm allowed some indulgence, I think, on this. The notion that I've addressed on a number of occasions is called the virtual state. And by that, I mean that the idea of a state is no longer confined to the traditional borders that we see drawn on maps. The example I use most often is Pakistan. What is Pakistan today? Is it the landmass northwest of India? Or does Pakistan, is there a virtual Pakistan that includes 800,000 Pakistanis living in the UK, close to 1 million Pakistanis living in Saudi Arabia, and large concentrations of Pakistanis in 20 other major communities around the world? I would argue that that is the real Pakistan today. And if you want to do public diplomacy directed to Pakistan, it's essential that you do that. And I would similarly argue that there is a virtual Israel. That actually has been defined for a longer time with the idea of the Jewish diaspora, the Israeli diaspora, sort of kind of putting together this virtual state. And the reason this is important to recognize this change is a function of communication, principally digital communication. Let me give you just a quick historical example. In 1912, in the United States, up to 100,000 immigrants a month were coming into the United States, mostly from Europe, many of them from Eastern Europe. They were coming from Poland and Russia. They were coming from Germany and elsewhere. And when they got to the U.S., really they were kind of stuck there. Very few of them went home, and the only way they could communicate with their families or with anyone in their homeland was by letter and good old postal mail. And it could take sometimes weeks, maybe longer than that, to get back. So they were there, and that was a real stimulus to assimilation, because they were no longer part of Russia or Poland or Germany or Ireland. They were part of the United States, and it just made sense to assimilate. But today, if you go from Karachi to London for a job, you can talk to your homeland every few minutes on your cell phone if you choose to. You can watch a Pakistani website. You can watch Pakistani satellite television. You can go on Facebook and stay in very close touch with your friends back in Pakistan or Israel or whatever the virtual state might be. And that I think is one of the most dramatic transformations of the world. It has made the borders, made those lines we see on maps and on globes, most of which, or many of which at least, in many circumstances were drawn by conquerors after wars, by victors after wars. And some of these lines have created tremendous problems. But they no longer are as important. So what this virtual state concept does is provide unprecedented cohesion. And I think when we talk about the virtual Israel, it is important for public diplomacy to try to extend that virtual Israel beyond the Jewish diaspora and try to establish friendships with non-Jewish constituents, people who are friendly toward Israel and would be well regarded, would be valuable assets in this kind of virtual Israel. Now, there are lessons that come up almost every day now. If you take a look at the situation in Egypt earlier this year, you can see that social media have tremendous value as a mobilizing tool. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, I think that still the most important medium in the Arab revolutions of this year was television, because so far the amount of penetration of things such as Facebook and just internet use generally, there's still the digital divide, but it is closing rapidly. And I think within 5 years, maybe 10 years at the absolute outside, that divide will have closed, and the idea of using things such as a Facebook type networking to establish relationships with people around the world will be even more important. For a state such as Israel that wants to get into this game, I think it's important that there be a diversity of output. Many YouTube channels, many Facebook pages, more Twitter feeds. And the striking example of how to do this, and I would urge anyone who's interested in this to look at this example, was the Obama campaign of 2008. That is why he won. There's a story that one of the Obama organizers of the cyber campaign was talking to Hillary Clinton long after the election, and she said, "Just tell me, how in the world did you beat me in Idaho?" I mean, Idaho is not an Obama state. There are very few black people there, and it just seemed like it was a state he couldn't win. And this organizer said, "Well, we had a network in Pocatello," which is one of the cities. The city is sort of stretching it in Idaho. One of the cities in Idaho, and you had a network in Idaho. We had a network in West Pocatello. We had a network of bicyclists in West Pocatello. In other words, they had so many sub-networks that they were able to organize with tremendous efficiency. Well, I'm not saying that Israel should model itself after Pocatello, Idaho, but on the other hand, I think it is very much worth a look at the Obama campaign of '08. He just announced officially yesterday his candidacy for next year's election, and I think this idea of network organizing will be carried to an even higher level on this. In terms of preparing for the future, it's necessary to always stay a step ahead. I thought it was, I don't know, amusing, probably not amusing, but strange to hear the conversation on the last panel where people were talking about the wisdom or lack of wisdom of Israel reaching out in Arabic language broadcasting. How in the world can you not do that? I mean, it just seems that so many other countries are doing that. Where's Israel? Russia's doing it, France is doing it, Germany's doing it, the Chinese are doing it. So where's Israel? Israel is basically staying a step behind. That is not the way to have effective public diplomacy. So I think that there needs to be some shaking up about that. One caveat that I think is very important, one cautionary note. Cyber diplomacy is not a substitute totally for traditional face-to-face diplomacy. There is a case going on now where the United States diplomatic service, mainly for security reasons, in its embassies around the world, has decided that they're going to go with they're going to rely on virtual libraries, a virtual presence. They set up rooms in universities and that sort of thing around the various countries where the U.S. has embassies. It seems to me that is very limited in its effectiveness because people still like people. So the message that I'm trying to deliver here is that for all the advantages that cyber technology brings to the diplomatic process and to public diplomacy, it would be folly for any country to rely on it exclusively or even too heavily. There's still a value for peer-to-peer, person-to-person diplomacy. That was something else that was being grappled with a bit during this previous panel, and I think that needs to be done right in pace with any development of high-tech diplomacy. So those are just some ideas to think about now for a while, and I'll look forward to talking about them further during our discussion time.
Thank you, Bill.